I'm honored to introduce Professor Kari Bo from Norway. She's a physiotherapist and an exercise scientist, and she published over than 280 scientific papers in pelvic for dysfunction treatment and incontinence. I'm happy to welcome you in our little studio in Zurich. Kari, your stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to actually come to Zurich. I'm very happy to be here. And thank you for inviting me to talk about my really favorite topic, which is physical activity good or bad for the pelvic floor. I work at the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences as a professor and also at the Akershus University Hospital, Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology. So let's just remind ourselves on the definitions of physical activity and exercise. So physical activity is any bodily movement produced by the skeletal muscles that results in a substantial increase over the resting energy expenditure. And this can occur during transportation, work or school, household or other chores, and also during leisure time, which we usually think about as exercise scientists and sport professionals, sport and fitness activities. Exercise is leisure time activity that is usually performed on a repeated basis over an extended period of time, which is called exercise training, with objectives as improvement of fitness, physical performance, or health. And fitness, to remind us, is not only cardiorespiratory fitness, but also strength, flexibility, and motor component, including balance. So already Hippocrates said that all parts of the body which have a function, if used in moderation and exercised in labors in which each is accustomed, become thereby healthy, well-developed, and age more slowly. But if unused and left idle, they become liable to disease, defective in growth, and age quickly. So today, of course, we have much more evidence for the good effect of physical activity, and we have guidelines that you can see in this slide. And we know very well that exercise is indeed medicine. And this has led to the WHO global recommendations on physical activity for health. Physical inactivity is the fourth leading risk factor for global mortality, with 6% of all deaths worldwide. And physical inactivity levels are rising in many countries, with major implications for the prevalence of non-communicable diseases and the general health of population worldwide. Adults aged 18 to 64 years are therefore advised to do at least 150 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic physical activity, or at least 75 minutes of vigorous intensity aerobic physical activity throughout the week, or a combination of the two. And for additional health benefits, we could increase the moderate intensity aerobic physical activity to 300 minutes, or engage in 150 minutes of vigorous intensity aerobic physical activity per week, or a combination of the two. And we are also advised to do muscle strengthening activities for the major muscle groups on 2 or more days a week. So, the pelvic floor is therefore maybe the only area of the body where we can ask, is physical activity good or bad? And as you can see, the pelvic floor muscles are situated at the very bottom of the pelvis, and they have to withstand every increase in intra-abdominal pressure and also take up the ground reaction forces from jumping and running. there are two opposite hypotheses on exercise and the pelvic floor, and I wrote about this in 2004 and now in a new publication in 2019. The first hypothesis is that general exercise training strengthens the pelvic floor muscles and narrows the levator hiatus, which is the area around the urethra, vagina, and rectum. This would then give us less urinary incontinence, anal incontinence, and pelvic organ prolapse. But, on the other hand, one have been concerned that this would have a negative influence on vaginal birth, making the pelvic floor too rigid and firm. The other hypothesis, going in the total other direction, is that general exercise training overloads, stretches, and weakens the pelvic floor and opens the levator hiatus. This would give more urinary incontinence, anal incontinence, and pelvic organ prolapse, but on the other hand, then give easier birth. So I will try to give you some of the evidence for either of these hypotheses during this presentation. So the impact on the pelvic floor during physical activities, the normal response to that would be no or little downward movement with closure of the levator hiatus area with little need for co-contraction of the pelvic floor muscles. A dysfunctional response will be too much downward movement and opening of the levator hiatus with inadequate response of the pelvic floor muscles. This may be due to low anatomic location of the pelvic floor, weak connective tissue, large levator hiatus dimensions, low cross-sectional area of the pelvic floor muscle, which may negatively affect both strength, coordination, and timing, and speed of the pelvic floor muscle contraction. And these factors would be inheritary factors, most of them. So what do we know about the maximal vertical ground reaction forces during activity? And this is a very old study from Hay and co-workers from '93, but you can see that in the lead foot of this Olympic javelin winner, Trine Solberg from Norway, the lead foot needs to take up 9.11 times the body weight. So it's a lot of pressure and impact on this. And you can see also from these other activities. Ground reaction forces was measured in this quite small study from Segmiller and McGraw, and drop landings was assessed from 30, 60, and 90 centimeter heights in 10 female gymnasts. They found that the ground reaction forces ranged from 27.1 at 30 centimeter and then up to 56 Newton per kilo at 90 centimeter, and that's where the gymnasts land from 90 centimeter. So it's no doubt that the pelvic floor of athletes need to withstand high ground reaction forces. When we look at studies that have tried to measure inter-abdominal pressure during different activities, we can see a huge variation. Also between studies and between individuals participating in the studies. So light lifting from 2 and up to 64 centimeter of water, doing the plank, for instance, from 23 to 95 centimeter of water, as was measured here. And they all differ in performance of exercises, the definitions used, and measurement methods, and the populations studied. So a huge overlap and basically a huge individual difference between athletes. And it's interesting to look at this study from Weir and co-workers because they looked at 30 women performing 3 repetitions of different activities, and they measured intra-abdominal pressure with a microtip rectal catheter. And they found that abdominal crunches, climbing stairs, walking on a treadmill, and many lifting activities did not increase abdominal pressure significantly more than standing up from a chair. And we would not tell anyone to not rising up from a chair, but there are some health professionals telling women not to do abdominal exercises because they want to protect the pelvic floor. And I think that is to go too far, actually. So if we look at inter-abdominal pressure during cough and aerobic activities, we see the same overlap and variation between different studies and different activities. And it's the same problem when trying to look at these studies together because they all differ in performance of exercises, the definitions and the measurement methods and the population studied. One study from New Zealand looked at differences in intra-abdominal pressure between pelvic floor safe and then conventional versions of exercises. So basically, these physical therapists, they thought that some exercises were more safe for the pelvic floor than others. They looked at 53 asymptomatic women with a mean age of 39 years age. The comparison of 10 pair of exercises, and the good about this study is that they controlled for age, BMI, and parity. They found significant differences in treadmills, so for instance, running versus walking, cycling, standing versus sitting, cycling, lunges wide and with weights versus narrows, shoulder press, and step-ups. But there were no significant differences in different forms of ball rotations, lunges, core exercises, push-ups, and squats. So they concluded that performing the recommended so-called pelvic floor safe version may not necessarily protect the pelvic floor and vice versa. And the limitation of this study, of course, is that this was done on asymptomatic women, so we don't know how symptomatic women would react to the same exercises. So, can pelvic floor muscle responses be measured during physical activity? This is the wish of everyone who's doing research in this area, but is it really possible to measure this during activity? James was the first in the UK to trying to measure this during simple activities, and then Constantino from Stanford also tried to do this in the 80s, and we in the 90s in Norway tried to do this with ambulatory urodynamics, with actually trying to do one stitch into the urethra of the participant to see if we could hold it in place when we were assessing the urethral pressure. And then we have this group from Switzerland and Austria, Lügenbuhl, Leitner, Kuhn, and Moser, Beinens, and Radlinger. They started out in 2016 and used surface EMG. For all these different measurement methods, so the EMG and the strength measurement or the pressure measurement, we have a problem with movement of the device during activities because it's very difficult to get it in place, and even with one stitch as we did, it didn't stay in place. And then when we measure pressure, can we really see the difference between intra-abdominal pressure or the pelvic floor muscle response? I don't think it's possible to do that. There is a new apparatus coming out from New Zealand. I've been working a bit on that, where we try to measure intra-abdominal pressure and the response at the same time and with the same apparatus, so that has some potential. But when it comes to surface EMG, the same group that did all these studies on surface EMG, they conclude that crosstalks from nearby muscle it's unclear whether the issue can be solved with today's technology. We know that there will be crosstalks in this area. So although these methods can be reliable, I don't think they are valid because they are not actually measuring what we want to measure, unfortunately, because I really wish we could do this. So back to what we know about what happens during physical activity. So in this study, we looked at whether one bout of 90 minutes of heavy general exercises could cause pelvic floor muscle fatigue. And we did heavy strength training and high impact endurance activity. And we found that after these bulk of exercises, there was a 70% reduced maximum voluntary contraction of the pelvic floor muscles, but there were no change in endurance or vaginal resting pressure. In another study from Middelkoff, they looked at 35 healthy nulliparous CrossFit women compared with 35 recreationally active women with a mean age of 24.8. They did either one bout or 25 minutes of CrossFit exercise or walking. And they found an increase in both groups in maximal vaginal descent and decrease in vaginal resting pressure. So not the same as we found, but there were no differences in pelvic floor muscle strength. But you must also remember that these were different exercise regimens, and we had 90 minutes and they had 25 minutes only. So do exercising women have stronger pelvic floor muscles? The theory is that there will be a stretch shortening cycle during all exercises, and that there may be also a co-contraction with other muscle groups. But this is, of course, very difficult to study because what about genetics? We know that there are selection to specific sports. If we look at studies looking at stronger pelvic floor muscle, this study from Arroyo and co-workers in 49 high-impact athletes found that they had stronger pelvic floor muscles than controls. And in another study from Brazil, pelvic floor muscle strength correlated with aerobic capacity and frequency of exercise. However, this study found that comparing 10 volley, 10 basket, and 10 handball players with 10 controls, there were significantly weaker pelvic floor muscles between the volley and the basket and the control group. And low pelvic floor muscle strength correlates with symptoms of urinary incontinence that has been found in many studies now. But there are also studies that didn't find any differences in pelvic floor muscle strengths. So in this study again with CrossFit, there were no differences between the CrossFit and the controls. In this study, there were no linear relation between physical activity and pelvic floor muscle strength in 100 postmenopausal women. There were no differences in 30 Pilates practitioners versus sedentary women, and there were no association between physical activity level and pelvic floor muscle resting pressure, strength, and endurance in this study from Portugal. And from Iceland, no difference in athletes versus the untrained. And also in this study, no association with pelvic muscle strength and physical activity level in 203 primiparous women 1 year postpartum. There has been a few studies on morphology, and this study from New Zealand used MRI in 10 athletes and 10 age-matched controls. They didn't have any difference in size of the pelvis, so that was controlled for, and they didn't find any difference in the genital hiatus. But the cross-sectional area of the muscle levator ani, the biggest of the pelvic floor muscles, was 20% higher in the athletes. But again, we can ask the question, is this inherited or is it due to the exercises that these women have done? They continued with another studies on 24 nulliparous elite athletes compared to 25 age and BMI matched controls, used 3 and 4D translabial ultrasonography, and the results show that it was again higher muscle diameter in the athletes, but at the same time, they had large elevator hiatus area on Valsalva in the same group. And there were greater bladder descent on Valsalva in the athletes. And no significant differences on hiatal area at rest or during pelvic floor muscle contraction. So although they have thicker muscles, higher muscle volume, the levator hiatus is not narrower. Do they have less or more urinary incontinence? The very definition of stress urinary incontinence is complaint of involuntary loss of urine on effort or physical exertion, for instance, sporting activities, or on sneezing or coughing. But we know that physical activity unmasks the condition, because if you're sitting still and not doing a lot, then you will not leak. The moment you start to move, and the more you move, statistically you will have the chance of having incontinence. So this is only unmasking an underlying condition. Continence relies on maintaining urethral closure pressure. And this is caused by activation of striated and smooth urethral muscles, the submucosa with prominent vasculature, estrogen level, we don't know much about that, resting tone and contraction of the pelvic floor muscles, and degree, and maybe the most important point, degree of downward movement and opening of the urethra during exercise. So, do women who exercise have less urinary incontinence? Epidemiological studies find that physically active women report less urinary incontinence. These studies mostly rely on walking conditions. However, they are cross-sectional studies, and we know that there is a selection bias, because women with stress urinary incontinence, they drop out of exercise. So we can ask, are they dry because they exercise, or can they exercise because they are dry? And if there is an effect of physical activity, maybe this goes via weight reduction. We know today that the prevalence of urinary in women participating in regular physical activity is high. 31% of sport students versus 10% of sedentary students reported urinary incontinence in this study. And in women with stress urinary incontinence, also in all studies from Norway, 2/3 of the sedentary women report urinary incontinence to be the main reason for withdrawal. And also 33% of exercises in a gynecological population in the US report urinary incontinence. In Australia, 40% of mid-aged women exercising have incontinence, and 30% of them avoided sporting activities because of incontinence. In this study from Italy, 15% of young and middle-aged women in non-competitive sports reported urinary incontinence, and this study about 50% of exercises. And important also in a study among fitness instructors in Norway, we found that 26% of group fitness instructors reported urinary incontinence, and it was the same in those teaching Pilates and yoga. And in this study, 24.6% of nulliparous women attending gyms versus 14.3% of controls reported to have urinary incontinence. And again, from Australia, above 50% among women attending gyms and exercise classes report this problem. And I'm not going to go through all these studies on elite athletes, but now we have studies from all over the world and in almost all sports. And you can see that there are very high prevalences of urinary incontinence problems in athletes. The highest has been in high impact activities, and the absolute highest in trampoline jumpers from Sweden, 80%. So if we look at these studies, the odds of having urinary incontinence is about 3 times higher in exercises versus controls. But does this matter in the long term? In this study, 20-year follow-up of former US Olympians were investigated, and there were no differences in urinary incontinence between those who had participated in gymnastics and track and field athletes versus swimmers. In our study from Norway, in the 15-year follow-up of former elite athletes and controls, we found that former elite athletes were not more likely to experience urinary incontinence later in life compared to controls. Former high-impact activities did not influence prevalence of urinary incontinence later in life, so that was the same as was found in the US. However, urinary incontinence early in life experienced during sport was strongly associated with urinary incontinence later in life. So do they have less or more anal incontinence? There are few studies in this area, but in this study from France, 14.8% of athletes aged 18 to 40 years versus 4.9% of controls reported anal incontinence, and most of this is flatus. In this study from Brazil, 64.6%, and there were no differences between athletes and controls. And in an internet survey of 311 triathletes, 28% reported anal incontinence. And our latest study from Norway, 80% of strength and Olympic weightlifters, and more than 70% reported leakage gas only here as well. And 61.8% of the males also reported this. Do they have less or more pelvic organ prolapse? There are few studies on pelvic organ prolapse as well. In a study, 49 women with pelvic organ prolapse stage more than 2 versus 49 women, we found that heavy occupational work was associated with pelvic organ prolapse, but low-intensity physical activity was not. And in this study, no association between odds of pelvic organ prolapse and lifetime leisure or strenuous activity was found, but there was a non-linear significant relationship with teen strenuous activity, meaning more than 21 hours per week, and that would be the athletes. 5% of female triathletes reported pelvic organ prolapse symptoms, and in Brazil, there were no report of this symptom. But again, from the latest Norwegian study, we found that 23% of female power and Olympic weightlifters were feeling a bulge when they were exercising. And in CrossFit, between 3 to 2 and 12 to 7% symptoms of pelvic organ prolapse was found in different studies. So can high-impact activities cause pelvic organ prolapse? This is one of few prospective studies, 116 nulliparous women examined with POPQ and questionnaire before and after 6 weeks of summer military training in the US. And they found that the smaller group of 37 female paratroopers they were significantly more likely to have stage 2 prolapse and worsening of the pelvic support regardless of the initial prolapse stage. And more severe pelvic organ prolapse was found after 1 hour of structured exercise in women planning surgery for pelvic organ prolapse. And there is an urgent need for prospective studies in this area. We know that the effect of exercise during pregnancy on the fetus and labor and delivery has expanded during the latest years. And we know that birth weights of exercising women are less likely to be more than 4,000 grams and not at an increase of being less than 2,500 grams. Exercise does not increase the risk of preterm birth. Exercise is not linked to risk of induction, epidural, episiotomy, or perineal tears, forceps, or vacuum delivery. And first stage of labor before full dilation may be shorter in exercising women compared to non-exercising women. And exercise throughout pregnancy may reduce cesarean section rate. And this compared with the latest study from Iceland looking into this. But what about the pelvic floor? Does general exercise during pregnancy affect the levator hiatus area? This study was done in Norway with 300 nulliparous pregnant women, and we defined exercises as those exercising 3 or more times per week. Pre-pregnancy exercises did not show any significant differences in levator hiatus area at gestational week 21 or 37. Those exercising at gestational week 21, there were again no significant differences in the levator hiatus area at rest or during a pelvic floor muscle contraction. And then we looked at exercise at week 37, and that would be the real exercises. I mean, they are just about to give birth. They had significantly larger levator hiatus area, so not smaller. At rest, it was 1.6 square centimeter lower, and larger, and during contraction, 1.1 square centimeter. There has been this question, as I started to say, does pelvic floor muscle training during pregnancy negatively affect childbirth? And now there are 12 RCTs in this systematic review. And the results show that pelvic floor muscle training significantly shortens both the first and the second stage of labor in primi-gravida women. And antenatal pelvic floor muscle training does not increase the risk of episiotomy, instrumental vaginal delivery, and perineal laceration in primi-gravida. So I think it's time that you can join me in trying to abandon the myth that you can get too tight to give birth by exercising the pelvic floor during pregnancy. So can pelvic floor muscle training treat urinary incontinence in athletes? We know that today there is 1 A-level evidence of recommendation for pelvic floor muscle training to treat and prevent urinary incontinence. There is only 1 RCT on athletes, and that's on 32 volleyball players. They had pelvic floor muscle training for 3 months compared to a pamphlet just telling about the symptoms, and they found significant improvement in favor of pelvic floor muscle training in pad test and frequency of leakage. So we need more studies, but we think that we can also treat women who have this really strong impact on the pelvic floor. So to end this lecture, is physical activity good or bad for the pelvic floor? Well, physical activity is only good if the pelvic floor can counteract the increases in intra-abdominal pressure and ground reaction forces. Physical activity does not protect against urinary incontinence, anal incontinence, or pelvic organ prolapse. Exercise increases 3 times the risk of urinary incontinence. And physical activity can therefore not be used to reduce urinary incontinence in women who leak during physical activity. There is some evidence that physical activity can cause and worsen pelvic organ prolapse. We do not know whether they have weaker or stronger pelvic floor muscles, those who are exercising strenuously. Women and female athletes may have larger cross-sectional area, but they also have larger levator hiatus and more descent. Physical activity and pelvic floor muscle training have no negative effects on labor or birth. And there is some evidence that general exercises and pelvic muscle training can reduce first and second stage of labor. So the need for future studies is what is the effect of pelvic muscle training on stress urinary incontinence, anal incontinence, and pelvic organ prolapse in strenuous exercises? What are the mechanisms of heavy exertion on the pelvic floor? We need prospective studies of women starting regular exercise training. We need to look at the impact of strenuous exercise on the pelvic floor in the early postpartum period. And not to forget, exercise is medicine. No one should stop exercising if they have complaints from the pelvic floor, but exercising women also need to train the pelvic floor muscle because we have evidence they do not know about the pelvic floor and they don't know how to train the muscles. So I would like to just thank my research group and my collaboration with Ingrid Nygaard, and thank you for the kind attention. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, Kari Bo, for the very interesting presentation. We have some questions from our participants, but unfortunately, we have just for one question the time of it. So the first question was, we saw that in the presentation we had a lot of research who has been done, and which is for the future. Which is the main topic you would investigate in it?
I think we need more research in the strength and the power lifters and the weight lifters, and we are doing research on that now. We need much more studies looking into if we can really treat, for instance, the gymnast, the rhythmical gymnast, and the strength lifters by pelvic floor muscle training, because they have an immense, pressure and impact on the pelvic floor. I think it's possible, but I think they also need to train more than others, because if you just have a cough now and then, you can cope, but those who are doing really heavy and strenuous exercise, they need a very, very strong and well-functioning pelvic floor. So we need to focus on that. And unfortunately, most trainers have no idea about the pelvic floor. So we need to try to inform about this problem and to help women to perform more and to stay active, because women, they withdraw from physical activity. And that's my main concern, because women should be able to exercise throughout their lifetime.
Thank you very much, Kari Bo. And she is also here in Switzerland because you having a speech tomorrow for Pelvic Swiss. So for some who will join, this will be very interesting for join tomorrow the symposium of Pelvic Swiss. And I give the lead to look at Davoli, our board member from Sport Physio.
Thank you. Thank you. And now I would like to pass the word to my friend and president, Nicola.